Time travel is a tricksy mistress. The fact of the matter is, very few franchises that weren't previously embedded with time travel have ever come out the better for it. It's almost always a one-way ticket to Shark Jumpville, and no, I'm not going to talk about that game. I promised myself I'd never mention it again. Sometimes it can indicate a lack of ideas, but sometimes time travel is introduced while a series still has a lot of gas left in the tank. But even then, it doesn't often come out the better for it, because a story is hard enough to keep together when everything is linear, but once you start implementing something as complicated and theoretical as time travel, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. In fact, I'm willing to go out on a limb here and say that no time travel story has ever been seamless. So with that said, does anybody remember that God of War had a time-traveling subplot? Despite the fact that it was basically the entire impetus for the second game, and results in not only the finale of the game, but the entire third game, it seems to be one of those details that's mostly just brushed aside because nobody ever seems to talk about it or acknowledge it. It's one of those things we've all just come to accept, so I wanted to take a little bit of a deep dive, or at least a medium dive, into the specifics of that time travel. You know, deep enough that if it were a pool, you could keep your head above the water by standing on your tippy toes. So how does the time travel plot thread go in this game? Well, long story short, after the beginning of God of War 2, Zeus betrays Kratos, tricking him into putting all his godly energy into the Blade of Olympus, and then through a slightly coincidental chain of events, Kratos gets crushed by the Colossus of Rhodes. And again, I kind of wonder what Zeus's plan was if that didn't happen, because I imagine him pacing back and forth in his godly living room, psyching himself up to fight Kratos, only to look through his godly CCTV and see that the universe just flipped Kratos the middle finger. Following this, Kratos is mortally wounded, and then he's finished off by Zeus, leading to his death for either the second, third, or fourth time, depending on how you interpret it. Only once he's dead and being dragged to Hades does Gaia show her face and reveal that Kratos needs to seek out the Sisters of Fate to undo what's been done, before giving him a magical resurrection. So far so good. In the Temple of the Fates, they interpret changing your fate as using the threads of fate to manipulate a portal to the past from which you can step right through and change whatever needs to be changed. This sounds good in theory, but when you take a step back and actually look at the bits and pieces, it kind of doesn't make any sense, and it leaves plot holes and inconsistencies the size of Vesuvius just sitting right there in the middle of the game. In time travel stories, there are usually two different broad categories that the time travel rules fall into: multiversal or linear. Multiversal is a circumstance in which there are infinite possible timelines taking place, and changing the past won't necessarily cause the future to cease to exist. It would merely cause the timeline to splinter off, causing a new timeline to coexist with other timelines. This is probably the most seamless type of time travel because it means you can basically change whatever you want and there won't be any paradoxes existing because the paradox can exist within a multiversal story, as that paradox is simply something from another coexistent timeline at that point. I would say the most famous of all multiversal time travel stories would probably be the Dragon Ball Z Android saga. Then you have linear time travel, which gets a little bit more broad and harder to define, though the definition usually falls into one of two different subcategories, the first of which is predestination. This is a case where the timeline has basically been set in stone and you can't change the past because what you did to change the past has already happened. So it's essentially a never-ending predetermined time loop. The most famous example of this will probably be Harry Potter when they used the Time Turner, which was used to go back in time and ostensibly change the past, but really they were just causing what already happened to happen without realizing it. Then there's the self-correcting single timeline, where causing a change to the timeline will cause everything from that timeline to cease to exist, including yourself if you change too much. This is probably the most complicated of the different time travel rule sets to work with because you have to be paying attention to absolutely every single detail, and even when you do, plot holes are pretty much inevitable. There's also hybrid rule sets and unique rule sets. For example, in Futurama Bender's Big Score, it operates on a single timeline, but neither has predestination or self-correction. It operates on a rule set that allows you to change anything, but the universe automatically corrects itself by essentially killing or destroying anything that could be considered a paradox. So what rules does this game abide by? Well, here's the thing, it doesn't really abide by a consistent rule set. When it comes to a time travel story where the timeline itself is positioned as a threat to the main character, you need to have a self-correcting timeline. Something like Back to the Future, for example, is a story in which, while the timeline is somewhat flexible, the threat of ceasing to exist is the entire conflict of the movie. This applies to the Sisters of Fate boss fight because the entire middle chunk of the fight has it to where the main conflict, aside from the Fates themselves, is the fact that they bring you back in time to the fight with Ares from the first game and start trying to destroy the sword that would eventually be used to kill Ares, the Blade of the Gods. This part of the game is very demonstrably a self-correcting timeline because if you fail to stop the Fates from destroying the sword, Kratos dies, and as a result, well, Kratos dies. So the fact that the past directly influences the present is kind of a cut and dry issue in that case. There's no predestination here. But then the rules of time travel are immediately contradicted after this. You see, if we didn't see what happened after Kratos originally died, we could have reasonably interpreted this as being a time loop where Kratos was always meant to come back to fight Zeus, but we know for a fact that Kratos comes back in time immediately after the death of his past self. However, during the first showcase of this scene, Zeus also kills the entire Spartan army in one swipe of the Blade of Olympus, but in this case, we get there before he has the chance to do that. So we know for a fact that Kratos did objectively change the past, and following the rules of the Sisters of Fate boss fight, changing this piece of history should cause a paradox, and as such, the timeline should in some way correct itself. The Kratos who came back in time should theoretically cease to exist because the context under which he came back in time has been completely changed. Or is the timeline just that forgiving? Does the paradox correction only affect these specific people who have had their life events altered? In that case, the Zeus that exists in the modern-day present of Kratos' future timeline might cease to exist.
Oh no, I've gone cross-eyed.
It's also worth noting that we don't see the first two Fates manipulating the threads of fate to go back in time. So perhaps these two different methods of time travel have different rules, but that's not established. But either way, the ending cutscene of the game seems to indicate that Zeus has called a meeting among the other Olympians on account of Kratos from the future coming back in time and nearly killing him. And not because of the events of the game that transpired before Kratos went back in time.
We have faced far worse than this one fallen mortal. But we are the gods.
It seems to indicate that there has been some light timeline alterations, but Kratos from the future is still the prime main character in this slightly altered timeline, which begs the question, what happened to past Kratos? You know, this guy. We popped in right after Zeus killed him, so presumably that means there's a paradox. Perhaps the only hard and fast rules with the time travel is that if your past self dies, your present self also dies. But by the end of this sequence of events, present Kratos is still alive, which means that past Kratos died in the exact same manner and was revived in the exact same manner. Because if he wasn't revived in the same manner, that means he's still dead, and the non-past version would also have to be dead because that's the only rule that's been undeniably established. So the Titans would have had to have resurrected him, and because Zeus is referring to the Kratos who came back in time, that means that's the new established timeline. And in that case, where the hell is past Kratos? Shouldn't that mean that the sequence of events for past Kratos is different, which would indicate a split? Which would indicate a temporal clone and therefore two separate Kratoses are walking around? Because if present Kratos didn't have to cease to exist to account for the new established timeline overwriting the timeline that existed before he came back to the past, then there would be some sort of paradox because the timeline is simultaneously changed and not changed, as the Kratos from the old timeline can also exist in the timeline that resulted from him meddling with the timeline.
I am so confused!
So is there a second Kratos, or did the two of them just merge back into one when Kratos went back to the future? A piece of proof that backs up the fact that past Kratos had to have been resurrected at some point and is still alive is the fact that Athena dies in the past and is still dead in the present, which, much like the Sisters of Fate boss fight, has a connection between the past and the new established present. And the fact that Athena is affected removes one of the potential explanations, that being that temporal shenanigans only affect mortals and not gods. So something f***y would have had to have happened on account of the splinter. And in fairness, we're not always seeing who and what would end up being affected by the temporal shenanigans, but when we do see what should be affected, these rules only seem to apply when they really feel like it. And it gets really confusing the more you think about it. These are the issues when you introduce rules and then don't stick to them. It creates more questions than it could possibly ever answer. And I don't even think they realized these questions were present. Such as, if the game is at least tokenly working with the rules of a single unbroken timeline that automatically corrects itself, did the Titans ever actually properly die? Or did they simply cease to exist for thousands of years when they were transitioning from the past to the present? One of the exceptions, of course, is Kronos. Now, we know that Kronos in God of War 3 is the same Kronos as God of War 1 because he remembers Kratos.
I live in torment because of you. After you took the box from Pandora's temple, Zeus was consumed with fear.
And confusingly, we never see Kronos from the past during the initial attack on Mount Olympus, which muddies the issue somewhat about how much you can affect someone's present by affecting their past in this series. But the fact that we don't see Kronos among the Titans we freed in the past means one of the primary questions remain unanswered. So hypothetically, if we did bring every single one of them over, would the likes of Kronos cease to exist in the present, indicating a self-correcting timeline, or would both of them coexist, indicating multiverse theory? Or once again, is it a self-correcting timeline that only self-corrects if your past self dies, but otherwise paradoxes can coexist? But the fact that we don't see Kronos from the past in the modern day setting doesn't necessarily mean he's not there somewhere. Otherwise, the only other option is that certain stragglers were left behind when Kratos brought the Titans to the future, and those stragglers are the 4 Titans we encounter in the modern day. Knowing the answer to this question would clear up a lot of the time travel confusion, but we don't get any answers. So either there's 2 versions of Kronos, or Kratos is a bit of a dick in that regard for leaving some of them behind. The other 3 Titans we encountered off the top of my head would be Atlas, Typhon, and Thera. And no, that's not me saying Sarah with a lisp. Thera is an interesting case because we actually encountered her in Ghost of Sparta, and she knew that Kratos was destined to break the Titans free.
It has been long since our kind waited for the one destined to free us.
So one wonders if she knew that it was his destiny because it was prophesized, or if he'd already done that for all intents and purposes, just with certain stragglers left behind. I don't have an answer, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Does fate actually exist, or are these prophecies just built off surviving witness testimony of past events combined with the knowledge of what will eventually happen at some point in the future? I guess I don't have an answer to any of that, because much like a lot of this, it seems like a question they didn't even realize would come up. And then there's the biggest issue of the time travel, which is why didn't he just do blank? Gaia explains he needs to use the Sisters of Fate to go back in time to when Zeus betrayed him, because that's the only moment he'll be vulnerable.
Your only hope is to find the Sisters of Fate and travel back through time to the moment Zeus betrayed you, for only then will he truly be vulnerable.
But why? If Kratos has access to all of space and time, then why does he need to go back to the moment Zeus killed him? Why not go back to the immediate moment after his past self was crushed and grab the Blade of Olympus before Zeus has a chance to grab it? Granted, they did swap ownership of the blade during the fight, so perhaps simply grabbing the blade wouldn't be enough, but how about this? Why can't he go back, say, 2 or 3 minutes beforehand and stop the Colossus of Rhodes from crushing his past self? I understand the fact that Kratos' past self is too volatile to be convinced that future Kratos is a temporal clone and not some sort of imposter, but at the very least, saving himself from being crushed would prevent Zeus from being able to simply take the Blade of Olympus. Then he wouldn't have been able to kill Kratos as easily, either the past version or the present version, and while he may not have been able to convince his past self that future Kratos is a temporal clone, if Zeus shows up immediately after this and outs himself as the person who betrayed Kratos, I'm pretty sure regardless of any believable temporal shenanigans, past Kratos would be on board enough with the whole temporal clone thing to be able to at least have a temporary alliance with his future self. And then there's 2 massively powerful people who can double team Zeus. And even though he ultimately fails to stop Zeus, what's stopping him from pulling an Austin Powers and traveling back and killing Zeus while he's fleeing at this specific moment? You know, while Athena is 6 feet deep into a sword. He's already weak, surely he could have just came up from behind him and stabbed him up the brisket. Sure, he may have only had enough time to make one more jump before the temple collapsed, but then what's stopping him from going back to before the temple started to collapse so he can get another couple of jumps? Or does the temple exist beyond space-time? Or how about we just sod the whole business and go way back into the past? Why not go back to when Zeus was a baby and then stab him in the face? The timeline seems to be inconsistent about what it will allow, but at the very least we know that death in the past at least theoretically results in death in the present. But I guess it also begs the question of whether or not killing your own parents will result in you ceasing to exist, or if the temporal banishment only applies to your past self. In which case, there's still a bunch of points in the timeline in which Kratos could have traveled and still not prevented his own existence. Which further begs the question, why did he even need to go back in time to get the Titans to begin with? A friend of mine theorized that since Athena made it very clear that all the gods would try and stop Kratos, that Kratos knew there was going to be a fight, so he needed some warm bodies to draw machine gun fire, so to speak. Though, once again, is there any specific reason why Kratos had to bring all the Titans to the exact present after his fight with Zeus? Are there some unstated time travel rules that means he can only bring people back from the past to the exact moment he made the jump, and therefore they can't collectively jump back in time to a previous point? Or could Kratos have just theoretically somehow brought all of them back to the moment his previous fight with Zeus was happening? Therefore, you'd have two different versions of Kratos as well as an entire army of Titans that can squash Zeus like a bug. Sure, there'd be no game in that case, but therein lies the issue with time travel stories with ill-defined rules. Could Kratos have done X, Y, and Z? If yes, why didn't he do it? If no, why? Then there's the most awkward question in regards to Kratos suddenly gaining the ability to go back in time, which is why didn't he just go back in time to save his own wife and child? That seems to be the general go-to when discussing the time travel in God of War 2, because it could theoretically undermine a lot of the trilogy's storytelling and forces you to basically come up with your own interpretations. I for one believe that in this specific instance, he has such a one-track mind determined for revenge that it never even crossed his mind to go back and try and save his family. But I have to come up with an explanation like that, otherwise the other option is the entire story of the game collapsing under its own weight. That's the funny part. I feel like I can come up with an explanation for why he wouldn't save his family, but I can't come up with an explanation for why he went the route he did, and not the potentially dozens of easier routes. Because the Titan invasion could have potentially been completely unnecessary if he put more thought into it. Perhaps it was a case of wanting to make sure the past doesn't get altered too much, but the timeline is seemingly more easygoing than that, and whatever rules there are, they don't seem to be hard and fast rules. At least there seems to not be any proof to the effect of the timeline not being able to handle a large alteration like these. The only other explanation I can think of in that case would be that Kratos is too proud to use time travel to his own advantage because he believes in a fair and honorable fight even against his most bitter of rivals. And to be fair, his Spartan pride wouldn't allow him to do so is a pretty good catch-all answer to a lot of the questions about this series. But even that brings us back to the issue of why he couldn't just go back a few extra minutes to stop his previous self from being killed so he could reabsorb all his godly powers from the sword. There are so many questions one might ask, and I feel like I'm only truly scraping the surface of all the potential questions raised by this whole situation. And I guess a lot of that comes down to maybe not necessarily the fact that the time travel rules don't make sense, but more so the fact that they're not very well explained. And if these specific rules of time travel were better explained, then a lot of these questions might have been able to have answers. But I guess the question is, does any of this really matter? I feel like God of War 2 as a game is good enough in its own right that you can more or less look past a lot of the issues. And I feel like a lot of people have, because when you really examine it, almost every time travel story runs into some sort of issue. It's basically impossible to make a time travel story without massive gaping plot holes, like I said. And yet some are held to higher scrutiny than others, so why is that? Well, because some time travel stories are simply better than others. If you are writing a type of story where it's inevitable that you're going to have some sort of issues with the plotting and progression, then you need to have good enough writing from a character standpoint that people can get invested in the story beyond the main thrust of the time travel. But you also need to have time travel rules that are, if nothing else, consistent enough that your viewers can follow along and suspend their disbelief. It's only once you have a combination of a poorly written story as well as poorly written time travel that people will start to scrutinize it. Because at that point, they can't either get emotionally invested nor can they suspend their disbelief. Once again, I promised myself I'd never bring up that game again. And I feel like the fact that very few people ever discussed the time travel in God of War 2 says to me that they succeeded at least to a certain degree. It may not make all the sense in the world if you really think about it, but the package as a whole is compelling enough and the time travel rules aren't ridiculous enough that the average audience member would really think about it for all that long. So I applaud them for that. They made it work as well as they needed to, and God of War 2 is one of the best games in the series in spite of whatever drawbacks it may or may not have. Does that mean I'm above nitpicking? Hell no. I'm never too good for nitpicking. Matter of fact, expect a full retrospective analysis on this game at some point in the near future, just as soon as we're finished with the first game. But until then, if you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. And if you want to support me in a more direct fashion, you can pledge to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as early access, Discord benefits, and exclusive content, along with these fine folks right here. And an extra special thank you to Dick Kickham, Ga004, Hydra Overlord, FarmCat84, Raph, Ranger X, Sketch Lombo, Sphinx, Will Stokes, and Weird Webster for going above and beyond. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.